I toured 4 compounding pharmacies in Houston, and I'd never been to a compounding pharmacy before, and I want to tell you so much that I learned during this process. So I'm going to break everything down. I toured 1 small compounding pharmacy, 2 medium compounding pharmacies, and 1 large compounding pharmacy. And there were a lot of things that were similar and a lot of things that were different. I toured Agerite, Empower, Vials, and Optimal Balance Pharmacy. If you don't know who I am, I'm Sabina. I work in the GLP-1 space. I'm not a telehealth. I'm not a pharmacy. My company, GLP-1, we help people navigate and compare options. So if you're ever like, hey, which telehealth is better than the other? What are the prices at all doses? That's what my company does. And as a result of that, I've spent a lot of time in this space examining differences between both telehealth and compounding pharmacies, but I'd never visited one. I also do a lot of content on access to GLP-1s. That includes legislation that's threatening access, litigation that's threatening access, and I try out different telehealths and do reviews of them. So follow if that sounds interesting to you. Especially because I'm going to be doing more content here on YouTube and long form content, partially because my TikTok got banned, and I think I can just talk about more things that I want to talk about in more depth here. I am low edit, so keeping it casual. Now, what is a compounding pharmacy if you're not sure? So you've seen maybe GLP-1s around, you're not sure what like the name brand, Zepbound, Mounjaro, etc. is, and the actual like compounding pharmacy version of it, what's the difference? Okay. So name brand, Zepbound, Mounjaro, Ozempic, Wegovy, those are FDA-approved medications created by the manufacturers and sold typically in like a retail pharmacy, sometimes in a direct-to-consumer pharmacy. Compounded medication is fundamentally different. When you think of a retail pharmacy, you might think of like Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid, where they basically distribute medication that has already been manufactured, and you buy it kind of like you might buy a bag of chips in a grocery store. Compounding pharmacies actually make the medication, and their medication is not FDA approved. So I can't make any claims about safety or efficacy of that medication. Typically, that happens when it's in shortage or if there's a medical justification for why it needs to be customized. Now, examples of compounding pharmacies: 100 years ago, most medications were compounded. And an example, classic example, is a kid can't swallow a pill. They crush up the pill, they put it in cherry syrup, the kid can now have a pill. If you have memories as a kid of having, amoxicillin with like that bubblegum flavor, there is a chance that your pediatrician compounded that in their office so that you could take a medication that only came in a pill form. So the likelihood that in your lifetime you will take some kind of compounded medication is actually quite high. But technically, compounded medication is not FDA approved. It's not gone through the same safety and efficacy testing that the FDA has, and it can't be marketed with claims like a compounded GLP-1 can't be marketed with claims that it's going to be safe or make you lose weight or anything that you might market an FDA approved medication for. It's kind of in this area where it's like a different treatment. To do some quick disclaimers, I work in this industry. I'm not directly partnered with any of the compounding pharmacies I toured. And nothing that I say is medical, financial, or legal advice. I am not endorsing or recommending specific compounding pharmacies. I went to tour them and approach this with curiosity. I'm not an expert on compounding pharmacies. I'm not a pharmacist. So just because I went to a compounding pharmacy and I was like, hey, this looks clean and good, does not mean that it's the same as somebody who's trained to inspect compounding pharmacies saying the same thing. And also, if I'm visiting a compounding pharmacy for 20 minutes, and most of that time is spent having a conversation with a pharmacist, that's not the same as an inspector going in, going through the records, seeing what their processes are in complete depth. And I just didn't have time for that amount of, thoroughness. I was in Houston. While many of the compounding pharmacies were in the same area, it was honestly a 30 to 45-minute drive between them. So I think the most I spent at one was an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. And part of that was I had lunch there because they offered to give me lunch. So to put that into context, I would also say, like, obviously as a reminder, like these are inspected and licensed at the state level. Some of them are inspected at the FDA federal level. I did not go through every single part of every pharmacy. I'll be generalizing about things related to compounding that apply to most of the pharmacies. That doesn't mean I explicitly asked every single compounding pharmacy, hey, do you do this exact same thing that the other pharmacy does? This is for general education of what I learned and curiosity. And I did not verify every claim or license that they touted that they had. So if they said, hey, they're licensed in 50 states, I did not go out of my way to verify or check that. Now we do check licenses on GLP Winner if you want to check specific licenses for a pharmacy in your state, but that wasn't an explicit part of this tour. I would also love to tour a facility that does FDA-approved medication and manufacturing. I know Novo Nordisk has one in Indiana. Would love to tour it and sort of like talk about what's different. If I had that opportunity, I would love to. This isn't just a blanket endorsement of compounding. This is like, most people have not been to a compounding pharmacy. There's limited education on it. I wanted to share what I learned through touring it, what I learned through being in this industry and learning more about that. Another thing I'll note is that I did film some. The larger compounding pharmacy, Empower, they knew I was coming like more than 2 weeks ahead of time. I'd scheduled that, and that's sort of when I was like, okay, well, I'll go to Houston, and then I'll see who else I can tour when I get there. So I knew that they would let me film and let me film basically almost anything I wanted to. I obviously did not film anything that had patient names or could accidentally reveal a patient name. And when I get to the Empower section, I'll go into more depth about what I did include in filming. But the other pharmacies, honestly, I toured them on a Friday, and the Wednesday before, I posted on LinkedIn. I was like, hey, I'm going to be in Houston. I have free time. There's a lot of compounding pharmacies in Houston who would give me a tour. And then I showed up and I asked if I could film. So some of them let me film certain aspects of their pharmacy, or one of them, I was talking to the pharmacist in charge, and was like, hey, I'm pretty new here. My boss isn't here. Like, I have to be safe. I have to say no just because I haven't explicitly gotten permission for that. And I totally understand because I kind of showed up out of nowhere. So I don't think that it reflects poorly on those pharmacies. To be honest, if they felt they were doing something that would look bad, they probably wouldn't have allowed me to tour them in the beginning, in the first place. So I just want to say that as a disclaimer. So if I have more footage of Empower than other pharmacies, that's because they knew I was filming. They were okay with me filming. There was more clear communication and more notice from me to them about that. And they're just better set up for tours, where many of the other compounding pharmacies, like, they might have a corner that's like cluttered with information. Empower is like a very large building, and I'll get into it when we get into the actual details on Empower. I also met with people who had no idea who I was, had never seen my social media, didn't know what I did, and maybe they thought I was a telehealth or something that they were going to sell to and give a tour to, and then I show up and they're kind of like, oh, you want to potentially put this on social media, and they got really fucking nervous. So that's my disclaimer on filming or not filming. Okay, to start out, I went to a small compounding pharmacy called Agerite, and I was actually really happy that I went to this compounding pharmacy because, honestly, it was so small that as a result, it was so simple. And they did sterile compounding, they did normal compounding. And if you're not sure, normal compounding might be when you're taking something like a pill or an oral medication, or you're compounding that. Sterile is generally injectables. And that has, like a different profile for what is necessary to have that be compliant. They didn't let me film any of the backstage stuff. So this is just kind of their storefront. They kind of had a med spa component where they do IV drips. And then in the back, I would say the entire facility was maybe 2,000 square feet, which is maybe think of like a decently sized 3-bedroom house, but not a crazy large house. That's kind of roughly the size of the compounding pharmacy. And when it came to the sterile portion, I thought it was very interesting to see, because what it essentially was, and this is basically similar versions in every other pharmacy, they had an anteroom. They had 2 rooms. One room was like a prep room where you would go in and you would essentially put on like a gown, a hair cover, a face mask before you ever went into the room where they did sterile compounding. And they use, I don't know if you saw during COVID, there's a lot of talk over like negative pressure. So there was air blowing in that room so that germs were not going to that room because air was generally blowing everything out. And when you walk into that room, you have basically this like sticky material that I've only seen before when I've toured data centers, because I'm from tech, not healthcare originally, where you step on it, it sticks on your feet. And really what it's doing is it's trying to minimize dust and dirt that might be on your shoes that you're bringing into that room. And then when you go in that room, you are covering your shoes, you're putting on an entire gown and outfit, and then you're going into the sterile room, which has even more air filters. These places around the sterile portion, they're very loud places. Multiple places in the tour, they'd be like, hey, here's the earplugs for people who want earplugs. So it's like annoyingly loud because there's a lot of like air blowing at all times because they're trying to keep the air pressure just so to make sure that they have a sterile environment. This is not from the small compounding pharmacy, but just as an example of somebody getting suited up, they're in the sterile room and then there's significant air filter and air blowing in that room. And then they do the actual compounding work under a hood like this. So the hood is further blocking contamination. They have a mask on, but if they sneeze, there would be a sneeze guard equivalent. And then it's also blowing air so that no germs are getting in that area that aren't what you would expect it to be. So that was some of the basics that I saw in Agerite when I visited it as a compounding pharmacy. And then I would say it was super interesting to just kind of talk to the owners of Agerite and kind of see what the vibe is. They are a small compounding pharmacy. I didn't get a sense of how many prescriptions they did or what numbers they did. But this seems like they are truly a small business. And I think most compounding pharmacies have, an average of 7 employees. Like by the numbers, they tend to be small. They are not all large. And it was really great to see sort of the simplest version. So I thought this would be a good time to kind of do a general overview of the process I saw in all pharmacies now that I've kind of spoken about one of the smaller, more simple versions. And again, I didn't ask everyone every question. This is me sort of making assumptions and piecing together what I heard repeatedly from many of the compounding pharmacies. So first of all, there's different kinds of compounding. I mentioned the non-sterile compounding, which is probably the most common, sterile compounding, and then there's also like hazardous sterile compounding. What does that mean? So sterile is typically injected, non-sterile is like pills or like patches, things that are not actually getting injected to your body. And then hazardous often means hormones. So that means not only are we protecting the medication, you're protecting the person from getting a dose of testosterone or estrogen that hasn't been accounted for, and then, having a medical situation as a result of hormone exposure. Only 2 of the pharmacies I went to did hormone compounding, so not all of them had the hazardous sterile setup, but it was definitely a higher level of protection for both the pharmacist or the person compounding and the actual kind of like entire setup. Now, the process is basically that compounding pharmacies have an entire process to source active ingredient, test the active ingredient. They go through an entire process before they ever offer medication. Sometimes it takes, between 60 days to 2-3 months to 6 months to fully set up to be able to offer a new medication because of the level of testing that they have to do. In some states, they have to even do, a study on shipping it and making sure that it's staying at temperature. It varies, but it is not a minimum setup. It's not like they're like, okay, well, I feel like compounding this, let's go. There's an entire process. And then my bias is going to be towards what it is for GLP-1s because that's where I work. And I assume most of the people watching are most interested for GLP-1s. When they make a batch of medication, I think there are limits on the batch size. So they make an entire batch of medication, they put it in a fridge, and then it's under quarantine. And while it's under quarantine, They take samples from that batch, they send it to a third party for testing to test for both sterility and that it's the compound that they expected it to be. And then it comes back, as passing the test, and then it gets sent out to patients. So I've noticed there's this trend or thing that I see in the compounded GLP-1 space where people are like, hey, the BUD is like 3 to 7 days, shorter than I think it should be for the amount of time I got a medication. And like, look, I'm not going to tell you to ever take medication that's past the BUD. Like, talk to your doctor, talk to the pharmacy about what you're comfortable with. But sometimes what causes that is that the state regulates what the BUD is for some pharmacies in some states, in some circumstances, right? I don't have a perfect understanding of the law. So if the BUD has to be 30 or 60 days and they have to send it out for testing and that takes 3 to 7 days, that's why the BUD you might receive in the mail, even with overnight shipping, might be a few days shorter than you would ideally want because they had to test the medication before they sent it out to patients. That's my understanding having toured compounding pharmacies. And that's the general overview of how the process works for compounding from a very, very high level. Okay, so I want to talk about my tour of Empower. Empower, describes itself as the largest compounding pharmacy in the United States. It is truly awe-inspiring. When I drove up to it, it was like, I didn't even know what entrance to go in. The building was so big. I didn't know how to film it because I am not a filmmaker here, right? Both of those buildings are Empower. And to be honest, like the best way I can describe it if you weren't there is it's like, imagine 4 Walmarts and then it's like at least 2 stories. It might even be 3 stories or like 2.5 with some of the industrial stuff behind it. There's 2 buildings like that. And I think one of those is the 503B and the 503A. They have both pharmacies there on site. And I will say it was like truly a facility, in every way that it could be a facility. Like all the people that worked there were wearing like matching Empower scrubs. I like had to sign in to go into the place and be escorted or potentially get a badge. It felt like a true, like large corporate feel, which was very different than all of the other compounding pharmacies that I went to. So that was definitely unique. Here is the non-sterile area. To me, this looks like a library archive, but it's also where people are dispensing. And the other part of it that you can't see down the room, they are literally packing or pre-packing the non-refrigerated medication. So it's like if you got 5 things, they would kind of put it together in a bin, and then that would go to the packaging area. I didn't film that area simply because it had too many patient names. But imagine this center console area is like almost like a library, and then all of these cubicles are people finding, verifying prescriptions, getting medication for patients. So I thought that was really interesting as basically the non-sterile version. And then I would just say, in general, Empower had so many fucking big machines. I don't even remember the names of all of them. I don't have time to rewatch all of my footage to figure it out. You can see here up there, you can see there is like a lot of air ventilation systems. There is a lot of electrical systems. There are redundancies. If there's a power outage, Empower's going to keep on compounding because it is a facility with like a capital F. And this is an example area. This was just their R&D area. So this had sterile areas. It was just sort of like a general, like had smaller versions of all the machines they generally use on all of their stuff. Everything that I saw was behind a window. So sorry about the glare, but I didn't actually go into any sterile areas because I was not gowned up. And also they probably don't allow you if you're not like a pharmacist or pharmacy tech. I have no idea. Right. But I was totally unqualified to go to those sterile areas. And to give you a sense of the non-sterile, like these are basically bookshelves of medications. This was just testosterone. This was just the testosterone cream section. because I think they also offer like injectable testosterone. And these are testosterone tinctures, but they had testosterone, I assume, not in various flavors because I don't think they flavor it, but they had testosterone in various amounts, various different sizes and creams, and it truly was overwhelming. Like I could get absolutely lost. I think they said that they compound everything from like, medications in the thousands per day to medications that are like only 3 of them at once because it's just a small batch with a small amount of demand. So truly like they did everything in compounding. So it was very interesting to kind of see all of that broken down. And then I will say, while everything was generally behind glass, there were so many different rooms, and there was a period where I had to basically not fully gown up, but put like, I don't know, a bonnet on my head and a like booties on my shoes to go in that area. And I still wasn't in the sterile area. I was just like, I guess, in rooms that were closer to the sterile area. And we had these situations where we were like, again, we're walking on the sticky thing to go through a doorway because we're minimizing all dirt and dust on our feet that we're taking into an area that, needs to be more sterile. So you see outside of these rooms, there are the sticky mats. If I was not looking in windows, this is like basically the entire tour, massive hallways in Empower, because it truly is a large building. I think I said, 4 Walmarts and then multiple stories of that, like a truly massive building. I probably needed a drone to properly film it, but I am not a filmmaker. I don't have time to edit these videos. So we're always kind of doing it live. I will also say that there were just a lot of people doing work. I think he's doing testosterone, which then is hazardous. So he has more kind of protection on himself. And this is a great example of what the sterile setup looks like, really. But to be honest, there were so many machines, so many different ways to sterilize things. They had many setups that were like, it would go in one door and it would be the dirty side. And then those ovens were some kind of sanitizer of various flavors. They had so many different sanitizers. And things would go in those ovens on one side and then come out the oven on the other side, so that the non-sterile version was never in the same room as the sterile version, which just felt, to be honest, excessive. I mean, there's too much true crime, but I just felt like everything looked like it was like a morgue where they're gonna like pull out a body. But that's my mental illness. It just seemed like a lot of different varieties of ways to sanitize things, many of which were over my head, like why you would use one type of sanitation over another sanitation. They even had like an elaborate setup for washing bottles when it came to getting the vials ready for actually being production ready. So this is the other side of one of those. You can see the sanitizers where things go in one side, unclean, come out the other side, clean, and that's like the sterile side. And then they have excessive, loud, noisy air filters in basically the entire room, anything that touches sterile or non-sterile, so that they are filtering absolutely everything. The other thing that Empower did was they had basically like locker rooms and scrubs that they provided for all their employees, maybe the entire building, or who were working with sterile. Obviously, if they were in an office job, they didn't need this, so that they could have like sterilized clothes that they were wearing underneath all the gowns and stuff that they had. It was definitely an entire facility and setup. And then here you can see one of the machines that is putting labels on vials, and then these vials will then probably be sitting in quarantine until, I'm a horrible camera person, I don't even have time to edit. You're just gonna have to tolerate this mess because I didn't have time. Sorry. But yeah, like putting on labels. Medium-sized compounding pharmacies had a machine like this too. A smaller one, maybe not. It wouldn't have the space for it, but it truly is like some kind of manufacturing facility. There's also, rooms and rooms and rooms of alcohol wipes, syringes, Some of the stuff I didn't film and Empower, or like the room where they're packaging and sending off medication, because I just had too many patient names on the outside of the boxes, where they're pre-packaging the boxes, like the prep room before things go into the box to get shipped out, because again, patient names. And then honestly, some of it was quite literally stuff like office space, offices, cubicles, meeting rooms. I thought that was boring. I didn't film it. But one thing that was really interesting was the redundancy. So these huge things are, I think some of them are air filters, some of them are UPSs. What's a UPS? It is basically a battery backup if the power goes out, and then they have diesel generators if the power goes out. But also the air filtration system upstairs where we are here, above all the sterile rooms, it was absolutely crazy loud. There was like no dust anywhere. And I contrast that with when I was in Houston, I went to go see NASA, like the Houston Space Center, and there's dust fucking everywhere. It was disgusting. I could smell the dust in the air. You know, obviously, like, this is a sterile facility. They said they don't allow pets. They don't even allow plants. They don't allow fake plants because they're worried that, you know, somebody will come to inspect the facility and get the wrong impression and think that they allow real plants, and that's like a biological issue. So this area is above some of the sterile rooms. It has like a weird vinegar smell because of the sanitation cleaning solution, which I don't remember the name of. I could probably find it out, but truly like a capital F facility, like massive organization. And then here's one of my favorite parts was these were filters filtering the air leaving Empower. So I don't know if this is for like every single room in Empower. Like, I don't know if you fart when you're in Empower Pharmacy, if it gets filtered out and the outside world never gets to smell your fart. I don't know what happens if you fart when you're in one of the sterile rooms, like if you're hoping that the airflow will blow out and that your fart won't go into the sterile medication. I kind of wish I'd asked about that, but it really was absolutely over the top. Like, to be honest, I don't even know how to poke holes in it, because I don't have the know-how to know what is excessive or normal or just above board. I really needed the other compounding pharmacy tours to contextualize everything that Empower was doing. And because Empower does so many different medications to be compounded, they had things like a lyophilizer, which is like a freeze dry machine, which I don't think they used for GLP-1s at all, but it was really big. It was probably really expensive, and it was part of the tour, but wasn't super important for what I was looking for, which is to be curious and understand compounding in general. Next, I'm going to talk about Vials. And when I said on social media, hey, I'm going to tour compounding pharmacies, people were most curious about Vials. So when they were one of the people who reached out to me, and that was one of the compounding pharmacies I got an offer to tour, I was like, yes, I'm going to go tour Vials, because to be honest, they kind of felt like they came out of nowhere for me as well. They didn't want me to do any filming simply because it was a newer pharmacist in charge who was sort of like, I don't know, I would need to check with my boss, not sure. And also, he had no idea who I was. And was quite literally like, do you hate compounding? Like what's the angle here? He was suspicious, which I don't blame him for, because compounding is under a bunch of scrutiny. But I think like by the end of the tour, he liked me. Okay. That was my vibe read on the situation. So compared to Empower, which, if you didn't look into any windows, was a series of hallways with like big rooms where the actual compounding was happening. For Vials, it was kind of like two big rooms, and to kind of contextualize the size, it was in kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, like a nondescript, like parking lot where like if there wasn't a name on the door, you'd be like, I don't know where I am. Like, this is basically, you know, random warehouse space. I'm not sure. But and this is a horrible video, I'm so sorry. I didn't have that much time here because I had to come straight from Empower, and there's 40 minutes to my next scheduled pharmacy. So I didn't get to spend a ton of time at Vials. I would describe it as like a huge room. One was like not sterile stuff. Not that they only do GLP-1s, so they functionally all do sterile compoundings. But the area where it was like the medication is made and we were packaging it into bags and checking prescriptions and all of that was like one big room. I would describe it as equivalent to maybe an average kind of Walgreens size. Definitely smaller than a grocery store, probably bigger than a small gas station, maybe the equivalent of a larger gas station. But I live in Texas, so we have pretty big gas stations here. But like a medium-sized space. I'm horrible at square feet, so that's what I'm going to use is retail pharmacies in buildings like Walmart and kind of like a Walgreens. The main room, it was like honestly just huge. There were people working everywhere. They had obviously an assembly line. He told me that UPS or FedEx comes literally 4 or 5 times a day, and they drive the shipments basically straight to the airport. I had never thought there were so many compounding pharmacies in Houston, how convenient it is to have compounding pharmacy near a major airport like Houston's airport. So I guess that kind of makes sense, right? I think in general, the sterile area, rather than being several large sturdy rooms, it was like, I don't even want to say temporary like construction. It was like a box that was built in a warehouse. So it was like a box that was built and there was space between the box and the ceiling because they had all of the air ventilation coming into those rooms. And then obviously the people who were in there were gowned up and protected, and it was fucking loud from all the air filtration. And so the sterile area was different in that sense, but it was like big rooms, fewer hallways, only did GLP-1s. One of my takeaways broadly, not just from Vials, but from like kind of everywhere, talking to these compounding pharmacies, is that the vibe is that really, truly, I think the way the law and instructions are written, they wish there was more concrete, this is what you should be doing, this is okay, this is not okay. Because I think where some of the regulation is written, it's sort of like, hey, make it sterile, make it safe. But there's no guidelines for like the minimum viable sterile is this. And I think they kind of wish that that was more clearly spelled out. And I think there was like a compounding pharmacy legislation that was brought forth through a compounding pharmacy group that was trying to codify more of that so that it wasn't, compounders teaching other compounders what has been compliant. And instead it was the law doing more clear guidelines for what is compliant or what is not compliant. The people at Vials were nice. It was a quicker tour. It, had all the same things that most people did, like a clean room, gowned up, anti-room, like people with like foot covers, masks, everything. And then of course, like fridges where they're quarantining medication while they wait for it to get tested and come back from testing before it goes out to patients. That was the overview of Vials. Let me know if you have any questions. I will link the GLP-1 or pharmacy page if you want to get a vibe for like what the reviews are, maybe who uses them. But they are relatively newer compounding pharmacy. I think they've only been around a year or two, and they've really started to ramp up in the last 2 or 3 months. At least I've been noticing them a lot more. And then finally, the last place I went was Optimal Balance, which was another medium-sized pharmacy, but they did more than GLP-1s. They did like some hormone-related sterile stuff and then some general, I would say, like, I call it retail. It's not retail. It's more like general compounding. I don't even know how much they do. I think over 50% of their prescriptions are GLP-1s, but I am not certain that I asked. That was just the impression that I got. And what's interesting with Optimal Balance, I will show a quick video of the area. It's quite literally in a strip mall. And what's interesting is it's a strip mall. Like you can see generic restaurants over there in the distance. Even though it's in a strip mall, like I think they've just been taking over more and more space is the vibe as like tenants move out of the strip mall, they just take over the space. So it's actually quite large inside, all things considered. A lot of people are like, are you going to Trava? This isn't necessarily Trava, but this is one of the pharmacies that Trava uses. And so one thing that was similar to OBP and Empower was they both had And I guess the first one, they both had places where patients could literally physically come in person and pick up medication. So when you walk into Optimal Balance, there's like a little, I don't want to take photos because there's patients in there and like they're picking up their medication. I'm not gonna put their faces on social media, but there's like a little ante room, almost like a pharmacy if you had 5 to 10 chairs in there where it's like people are waiting for their prescriptions or picking up their prescriptions. Empower also had a place where patients could pick up prescriptions. I didn't go into it because I went into a different entrance. And as we covered, the building was absolutely fucking huge. I kind of intended to go in, but by the end, honestly, it had been an hour and a half and I really needed to go to my next pharmacy. So I didn't get a chance to go in, but there were constant patients coming in and out of Empower. So there was like constant foot traffic of like cars come up, people go in, people come out, people go in, people come out. It felt more like, I would say, at least in my neighborhood, busier than any like Walgreens or CVS I can think of in my neighborhood as far as like people constantly coming in. It was like absolutely happening. Optimal Balance, they had a really busy waiting room as well. And, they have stuff for, non-sterile. They like, this sounds stupid. This is my favorite part. Literally the pills in all the pretty colors that will get compounded with, whatever. I like the colors. And they also had sterile and hazardous sterile. So they had multiple sterile rooms and clean rooms and an ante room. And, it was busy and people were working, and they also had tons of office space. It was a very busy compounding pharmacy, but at a much smaller scale than what Empower had. And this is kind of generic video footage. I know the window looks dirty. I asked at one of the compounding pharmacies, it's because I have to sanitize it with a special thing, and it is not fucking Windex. So it doesn't always look great in that sense. So it was really interesting to see the medium-sized ones. One was like almost basically completely oriented on GLP-1s. The other was a little bit more well-balanced, but GLP-1 biased, and just seeing the entire process they went through to get medication. It really, I would say it really makes you feel different about like the idea of like gray market stuff. So I know for gray market, or like the joke I always used to like to do is like bathtub tirzepatide, like truly the fact that they have these like sterile environments and people are gowning up and there's all this extra process and then they're testing the medication after, it does feel like a totally different standard than somebody reconstituting medication in their kitchen where they have not a necessarily standard or sterile environment or standardized things, and then they aren't testing the medication afterwards necessarily. Like, it definitely feels like a different standard than what I've seen. I will say, from a very high level, everything seemed very clean. Everything seemed like very high process towards keeping sterile and non-sterile stuff in place. Particularly Empower just like had so much process because it was such a large company. I think they have like thousands of employees. OBP, I would just estimating by the number of people there, I would think is more like 50 employees that I saw working, but it was also the end of the day on a Friday, so I don't know if people leave early. And then Vials, it felt more, that's harder to say. I want to say in like the 5 to 10 to 15 employee range. The first place I went, Agerite, I think it was more around 5 employees, maybe like 4, if I'm being honest. So just seeing all of these different scales of compounding pharmacies and what it took, it was really interesting. I think I want to do more tours like this. Let me know if it's something you want to see. I might try to do 1 a quarter, potentially going back to Houston because that's convenient for me and there's a ton of compounding pharmacies there. I've had people reach out since I did this tour and offer me tours from places that I am kind of interested in seeing. So if there are pharmacies you want me to tour, can't promise that I'll get to them right away, but I might try to get to them maybe in like 2 months. And then I might do some flights out to less common places. Like I've heard in this process that BPI has an amazing facility because they're actually like a drug manufacturer. So I'm kind of showing my hand. I might ask around and see if I can get a tour, maybe in like June or July when I think I'll be in Florida and close enough that I could do that. But if there are additional questions you have, I may not have answers to every single one of them. I may be able to find out a generic answer to a generic compounding pharmacy question. One of the questions I kept getting asked was, like, oh, are they using salts? Are they not using salts? Basically, one question I asked, I think almost everyone, was, hey, if you get API that is not what it's supposed to be, how would you know, right? And a lot of them walked through like a laundry checklist of like, well, here's all the ways that we'd figure it out, probably before we even made the medication, probably, and also after we sent the medication out for testing, and basically all of that. So I thought it was super interesting to kind of learn, like, how does this work? How would you know if you were given API that was not what you expected? Because of course, API has been under, which is active pharmaceutical ingredient, has been under the microscope, both with legislation and other things going on. So hopefully this was interesting. Hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully my lack of editing is not too horrible, because I do not have time to edit, and I am so sorry for what I've put you through here. But let me know what you want me to do next, and give me a follow and like if this helped, and let me know in the comments.